to Admiral Sir Lionel Preston, who was commanding that area at the time. The greatest, perhaps, of all long-distance races, in 1934, the London to Melbourne race for the centenary celebrations of that city. Symbolizing the long-distance pioneer flights, solo record flights, this Harmon Trophy, an American award, won 3 years running by Miss Jean Batten, the great New Zealand solo pilot. Bringing the air racing picture up to date, the post-war Royal Aero Club Jubilee Trophy, awarded annually to the British air racing champion in our racing series. And most up-to-date of all, only one race of this kind has ever been held outside the United States. It's held here this year. The new Formula One midget racers, been introduced into Europe by the Royal Aero Club. I suppose probably the most famous trophy in the history of aviation, the Schneider Trophy. It was originally produced in 1913 by a French arms millionaire, Jacques Schneider, as a contest for racing seaplanes. For seaplanes because they believed in those days that they would never be able to have land aerodromes big enough to accept aeroplanes with the speeds they thought they'd get. Over the years, until the final trophy in 1931, it had more publicity than any other single trophy of, certainly of aviation. It was won largely by about 3 nations. It went a little like car racing. Initially, it was won by the French in 1913. They were, of course, the great progenitors in Europe of aviation. Then, surprisingly, by Britain in 1914. And after that, it was something of a battle between America and France and Italy and ourselves, who were then the great, apart from Germany, the great aeroplane-producing countries, until 1925, when the Americans held it, and it was decided to hold the contest every 2 years in future. The reason for this was that the cost of producing these gigantic seaplanes with engines of horsepower that commercial aviation hadn't dreamed of was rising to the point when only governments could do it, and even governments weren't that anxious to do it themselves. To produce a team of 3 or 5 seaplanes and train a team of pilots specially to fly them at speeds that nobody else was reaching, these were world record speeds in those days, cost a phenomenal amount of money. To such a degree, in fact, that after the 1927 and 1929 contests, when Britain was in the lead, Britain won in 1927, and consequently the next contest in 29 was held in Britain. We won again in 1929, with the second time with these fabulous racing supermarine seaplanes designed by Mitchell. And then the bombshell from the government of the day that they would not support defending the trophy. This was particularly a bombshell because if we won it a 3rd time under the rules, then we kept it outright. Well, 1931, of course, was a period of recession. There was no money about. And the government were perfectly right, there's no doubt about it, that this was not the sort of enterprise on which you could spend public funds. Luckily, the Royal Air Force promised to keep the high-speed flight in being. This was the flight of specially trained RAF officers and maintenance crews based at Calshot, where the seaplanes were kept, which actually did the racing. And if the money could be found by the Royal Aero Club, the government promised that they would not disband the high-speed flight. Well, the money was forthcoming from an eccentric lady called Lady Houston, who was a great patron of various things, and was the kind of lady who was usually against the government. And she said herself that when she gave the cheque for £100,000 to the Royal Aero Club, that it was done just to spite the government and stop them being spoilsports. But with that money, the Royal Aero Club mounted what turned out to be the final race for the trophy. We had a team from the RAF. We had these 3 wonderful Supermarine F-6B seaplanes, 2 of which are still in existence. We had this magnificent racing R-type Rolls-Royce engine, which was a sprint engine producing well over 2,000 horsepower. And it drove in the final contest a very heavy float-strutted seaplane at just under 400 miles an hour around the course, which was the most phenomenal speed. And 4 days later, a second flight put up a record speed of 407, which was a world speed for a good many years, world record speed. One of the rules said that if the trophy was not challenged within 3 years, it became the definitive property after the winning country had won it 3 times. It was not challenged, and here it is with us here. It's been the symbol of high-speed flying ever since before the First World War. It's still a magic name to conjure with. Proudly in the front, the first British win, Howard Pixton in 1914. Howard, who is still alive, living in the Isle of Man. And round to the side, Jimmy Doolittle, then a young pilot in the American Navy, who won the trophy for America. And it will always, I suppose, be a symbol of this kind of sporting flying, the peak of the whole thing. And, of course, the most famous of all stories connected really with the trophy, I suppose, that the design and building of the Rolls-Royce R engine and the Supermarine high-speed seaplane led directly, of course, to the Merlin and to the Spitfire. Competition flying, of course, is as old as flying itself. When you've got 2 aeroplanes, you've got a competition. Real flying didn't hit Europe until the Wright brothers came over in 1908 and shattered the French by the control they'd achieved with their machine. The world's first big international event, the Reims meeting of 1909, was set up the first races, the first records, the first top performances of every kind. These were followed by events all over Europe, and the Daily Mail, through Lord Northcliffe, sponsored a very large number of events. The first Channel crossing by Blériot in 1909 was for a prize put up by the Daily Mail. The first London-Manchester flight, which was won by Paulhan of France, and of course the great transatlantic race in 1919, all for Daily Mail prizes. Claude Graham White, who was runner-up in the competition between London and Manchester, the great race, was one of the pioneers of British competitive flying. At his aerodrome at Hendon, from 1912 onwards, every week, every weekend, there were races and competitive events. He instituted the Aerial Derby, the first big British air race, which was a race around London, which went on after the First World War. And in 1922, we had the advent of the King's Cup, the greatest, certainly the best known, of all aerial racing trophies. It's been raced pretty well continuously, apart from the Second World War, since 1922, when King George V instituted it. The King's Cup